Hi, welcome back to my channel if you're new here. Today's video is a very exciting one. It's one of my favorites to film every year, and that is my favorite books of the year. Obviously, it's a fun video to film because I just get to talk and gush about my favorite books. I have 12 here. I couldn't narrow it down to 10, so I did one per month. Now, I read some 5 stars in other months, so it's not like necessarily I'm picking one from every month I read, but just 12 for the 12 months of the year. I am so excited to talk to you about these books. I just have a really good reading year this year. I really focused on reading things that I just wanted to be reading, and I read some popular books, but I also just really picked out books that I truly thought I was going to love, and I think that's worked out so well for me. And so I have a top 12, but I think I have 4 books that really stand out as like my top books of the year. So I'm going to talk through the other ones first, and then we'll get into my top 4 that I would say are probably like my favorite. Now, a lot of these books though have made it into my all-time favorite books for different reasons and in different categories. That's something I love so much, is I found books in categories that I hadn't really had favorite books before, but I can solidly say now are favorite books in those genres. So that's what I'm really excited to talk to you about today. And also, I would love to hear your favorite books of the year. It's just so cool to see what people loved and were reading this year and what really resonated with them. So I'd really love it if you leave your favorite books down below, some of them that you read this year, because I would love to hear them and discuss them with you. So without further ado, let's get into the video. So I've read a good amount of series this year. I tried to focus on continuing series and finishing series that I was in the middle of, but there's one series that I read start to finish at the beginning of the year, and I haven't really talked about it since then, but it has truly become one of my favorite series. It's got everything I love. It's got fantasy, it's got historical, and it's got mystery and horror. So like, just sign me up, you know? And so that series as a whole, I would say is a 5-star series for me. So that is The Diviners by Libba Bray. This is not a new series. This has been out for a while. This first book was published in 2012. So it's been a while, and I am just now getting to it. But this is so good. It is a kind of genre-bending story. It's set in the 1920s in New York City, and we're following different characters as they kind of learn about these abilities they have. So each one has a different ability to do something. So our main character that we're first introduced to, she can touch objects and read people's past from them. And in this one, there's ritualistic killings that are happening, and they're kind of figuring out what's going on. But over the course of books, the threat gets bigger and bigger. And the thing I really truly loved about this series was, one, I think Libba Bray did different characters so well. Each one felt like their own separate character with their own identity, and everybody added something to the story, and you got to see just how different people live. There's so many different kinds of perspectives in here, and from all walks of life and all backgrounds, and I thought that that was really cool to see. You get to kind of see everyone grapple with this thing that's happening in different ways, and so the characters are really what sold the story for me. But also the atmosphere in this book is just so well done. Like, from start to finish, it's just got this foreboding creepiness, and it ramps up as time goes on, and you just really get to see power and greed and how that affects people. And you get to see a lot of hate, and that's hard to read about, but you see like hope within that, and you can just see how hate really can destroy people, and you get to see like people thriving and surviving despite all these hardships. And I think that that was just so well done. I really felt for every character. Every single book made me cry in some way, and I just truly connected so much with this group of characters, and I could not love them more. I think my favorite out of all of them is probably The Diviners, just because it was the first one that really got me into this series. But truly, I love them all. I really thought that Libba Bray just did so well with this series, and now, because of this, I want to go and reread the series she had that kind of loosely connects to this one, because I had read it in high school, and it was one of my favorite series then, and I just never knew about this one after. You just get to see a character from that other series in here for just a little bit of time, and so I think that's so fun. So I really want to go back and reread that one, because I just love this so much. It's made me very much nostalgic for that series and as a whole. So The Diviners is a perfect YA horror fantasy mystery series. I would highly recommend it if you haven't read it. If you're like me and one of the people who haven't read the series before, I just think it's amazing. Then I have a book that I picked up and it just sounded like a good book at the time, and I hadn't read from this author before, but it just really spoke to me and it became a favorite. It's something I still think about a lot. So that is The Magician's Daughter by H.G. Perry. And this is a historical fantasy book about this young girl, Biddy, and she lives on an island and she hasn't really explored outside of it. She only has known her adopted father, Rowan, and his animal companion, Hutchincroft, who is like a spirit who can turn human-like and rabbit, but spends most of his time in rabbit form. And she's just thrust into a circumstance where she ends up having to go to the mainland for the first time and is dealing with what her adoptive father Rowan's past has been. Magic in this area is like very dwindling, and so she's trying to work with him to figure out what's going on with the magic, and also she's just getting to know the world as it is because she's never been out in the world. And the thing I really love about this is it feels like a coming of age story in a lot of ways because you're following Biddy as she's encountering this world for the first time, and she's starting to realize that the world is a lot crueler than she thought, and she just is having to see the darker things of this world. She's going places where she's seeing just people having a hard time and suffering, and it just really changes her worldview. And there's also a part of the book where she has to really grapple with this idea of seeing your father figure in a new light or seeing your parental figure in a new light. And I thought that that was really well done because at first, you know, Rowan is just like this perfect father figure to her. He's taken care of her whole life. He's let her have a lot of freedom and he's taught her like independence and creativity and like all these really great things. But now she's going out into the world and she's having to see him and his flaws for the first time. And it's really impacting like how she has to go about saving this world. And I just think that that conversation was really well done as well. And the atmosphere in here is really great. I love the animal companion. Her and Hutchincroft are my favorite duo. Like I loved them so much. So it really had a lot of heart to it. I really enjoyed how the magic system worked in here and learning about the magic as well. I think it's a very light fantasy in terms of world building and magic. It's got light world building because it's vaguely like Irish in the 1900s. That's kind of the vibe, or 1800s. So it doesn't do a ton of like intricate world building if that's something you like, but for me, I really love that. And the magic system itself, it wasn't overly complicated, but there is like things to figure out along the way. So I thought it kept my attention just the entire time, and it is definitely a favorite of the year. Next is one of my only horrors of the year that is in my favorite books. And this one was kind of an unexpected favorite. I had put off picking up for a really long time, but I'm so glad I did. That's Slooh Fo by Bram. I read this in a horror reading vlog in October. It was the perfect time to read it. This is a puritanical story about this young woman who has to kind of make her way on her own, and the village is very much a male-dominated society, and she is trying to thrive despite having a lot of things going against her. Specifically, her brother-in-law is trying to take the farm from her, and so she's trying to save her life and her farm. And you're getting also this perspective of the spirit in the forest, and I loved that about the story. I loved getting the spirit's perspective and seeing from like this entity that is super scary, but you're really getting like his own kind of understanding of himself. He starts off the book not remembering who he is, and so you're following this journey of like him figuring out who he actually is. And then I really connected with Abatha just right off the first page. And the thing that Bram really did well for me was he created this setting and atmosphere super well. That's something I've realized I really love this year, is that I love when you can just go into a book and the writing just portrays the setting so well. And it felt dark, it felt creepy, but it wasn't overly graphic until the end. Like there are graphic scenes and it's definitely a horror book, but it really just connected me with the characters and connected me with the setting right away. And that's what I really loved about it. It made me feel so many emotions. There were parts of this book where I was screaming at the characters in the book, just how horrible they are to Abatha and to women in this town. And yeah, it just made me feel like a range of emotions, and the ending was very explosive. Like it wasn't the most action-packed thing, but at the same time, like the horror really ramps up and you just see her Abatha's change from start to finish of this book, and that's something, her character journey was something that really drew me in, and especially in the last bit of it, just seeing how all of that unravels was just so well plotted and really good. I don't know if this is something that will be everyone's favorite, but it's just really shown me that historical horror, creature horror is really my thing, and I loved every minute of this, and I loved what a whirlwind it was. I could not put this book down. It was one of those books that I just immediately was sucked into and like couldn't think of anything else, couldn't read anything else until I finished this book, and that's a sign of a really good book for me. So this has quickly become one of my favorite horrors ever, and I love that I'm finding new things that I love in genres. So super happy I read that and expanded my horror horizons. Now we have a recent favorite, and this one is also one that I picked up thinking that like I wanted to give it a try because it sounded interesting and I had heard good reviews, but I wasn't really sure if this kind of thing would be my thing, and I absolutely fell in love with it. And that's Kaikeyi by Vaishnavi Patel. This is a Hindu retelling of the King Ramu. He was banished and by his wicked stepmother, and he goes through this whole journey for 10 years, and he comes back, and in the end he's able to defeat this evil king, demon king, and it's really the story about Kaikeyi, and has her as the evil stepmother who banished him and like why she did that. And it really humanizes her character because in the originals, I guess she is not well portrayed. She's just kind of this evil stepmother character. And that's true in a lot of mythology retellings, is a lot of women don't have a lot of agency in the book. And so I really wanted to try out something where it's a retelling of the woman's character and why she is the way she is. And so we're following her as she's going from childhood into this marriage, into like a queendom and having kids and stuff. So it's a very slow character story. This is not a book that's action-packed with things. For a good 80% of the book, you're just following Kaikeyi and how she is like using this magic she has and how she's trying to navigate like court politics and being a wife and having kids and all this stuff. And then in the last 20%, you're following her as the real plot of like why she's banishing her son starts to really unfold. So it's a very slow moving character story. It's not fast-paced at all. I would say this is probably one of the slowest paced books I've read, but that being said, there was not a moment of boredom for me in here. I was just loving her story so much. I just really enjoyed seeing her having to go through being a child who's losing her mother and trying to like have guidance as a young girl who's now being forced to marry to help her kingdom and taking on this role of queen, and just like kind of the idea of like womanhood when you don't really have someone to teach you the way, let alone also having to learn about how to be a queen. And she has this cool magic. I really liked learning about how she uses her magic, and the way it shapes her and her relationships with other people was really interesting. And I think that Kaikeyi is someone that I can really understand why she makes the decision she did. And it's not that every decision was like the best decision, but you really get to see her and really empathize with her and the situation she's in and understand where she got to where she is. And I loved it so much. I have no critiques of this book. It was so perfect. It really showed me that retellings could be my thing. I always see Greek retellings, and I don't know, that's kind of what put me off of retellings, but I saw this one as something that I haven't really learned anything about Hindu myths and legends. So like to see this as a retelling, I think was really cool. And so I definitely want to dive more into myth retelling specifically and see what I can like in them, because this was just great. And I definitely will be picking up her new release that comes out next year. This is a book I've talked about pretty regularly this year on my channel because it was a book that just really hit me right where I needed it at the time I read it. And that is The Midnight Bargain by C.L. Polk. This is a historical fantasy romance where we're following a main girl who is trying to help her family, and to do that she needs to marry because her family needs money. But all she wants to do is become a magus, which is like a wizard essentially who can do magic. And the way like magic works is you have to bind a spirit to you, but it's very dangerous. And in this society, men are the only ones who are taught to do this, and women have to wear these like collars because if they get pregnant while they are not wearing the collar, their children could turn out to be like very evil wizards that no one can control. So women are very much controlled in this society, and we're just following our main girl who desperately wants to learn magic, but knows she has to marry for her family's sake. So she ends up striking up a friendship with another girl who is also desperate not to marry and wants the same thing as her, and they kind of have to work together. And then there is a romance with the brother of that friend, and it's just a very slow build romance, and it's very sweet because she's also fighting against, like, she doesn't want to marry, and it's about him and like his support of her, and just really like it's about challenging women's roles in this time. And I thought that it could be on the nose for some people with the collars and things like that, but I think the conversation it had was so good, and I just really felt like it was a sweet romance, and I just really wanted good things for these characters, and I really just fell in love with the characters. And as you can see from my stack so far, if I really fall in love with characters, it's probably going to be a book that's going to stick with me, and that was just this in here. I loved the way this world was written. It's again very historical, and there's magic elements, but it also feels very just historical fiction-y in a lot of ways. And I didn't realize in fantasy that I could really like a romance book until I read a historical fantasy romance. Like, it's just a slow burn, wholesome story. It's just a like truly slow burn up into the last page kind of romance. So I found that that's something that I really can like in books, and this really showed me that slow burn is definitely my thing. I think that there were so many just beautiful conversations about womanhood, and there's a really powerful scene in here with her mother and talking about the collar and stuff, and it was hard to read, but it was also like just a very powerful scene of talking about like what you kind of are forced to give up when you become a mother and become a wife, and making sure that that's the decision you want, because it's not for everyone. And I thought that the conversation in there was really beautiful, and I really liked the way this ended. And yeah, I just think it's a beautiful book. Next, I have a book that I picked up kind of on a whim, and it's a fantasy book that is very steampunk, and I think that's something that I didn't realize I could enjoy in a book, and that is A Master of Jinn by P.J. Clark. This is set in like 1912 Cairo, but it's very much like an alternative history, and it's got a lot of like spirit steampunk elements. While there's fantasy, there's also like robots and like mechanical elevators and stuff like that in here. The premise is basically that like jinn have been freed and they walk around and are just part of society. And we're following a main detective who she is in charge of looking into cases that involve magical beings. So there are other kind of creatures or magical beings in here, but the main thing is like jinn. And we're following her as she goes to this case that's really weird. There's a bunch of burned bodies in here. It seems like maybe a cult was meeting, and she's trying to figure out what happened. And it's just a very windy mystery that has to do with jinn and this like machine. Now, there are a lot of things that are alluded to that are from little novellas that happened before, and at first that really struck me as something that I wish I had had the full story, because there's a relationship in here as well that is formed from the other novellas. But having gone back and reading the first novella, I really feel like you could read this by yourself, and I actually don't feel like it took away that much of the story for me, because even though at the time I gave it 4.5 stars because of those missing elements, it's something that I constantly think about. I constantly think about this book and how just like different it was, and how much I really just enjoyed the long mystery elements and the steampunk elements of the story. It's definitely a longer mystery. It's kind of a mystery that like you just go along for the ride. You're really with her as like kind of a detective figure, and I really liked that, because I liked that it wasn't all about the big reveals and the big and twists and turns. It really is about building this world and building this character, and her backstory, and just like how the world works was so interesting. There's so much history in here. P.J. Clark really like took this world and then created this alternative history with it, and like that's a lot of the story. You're just getting so much backstory of how things are the way they are, why jinn are walking free, and why like this character has to investigate these kind of things. And I really love that. I think there's something so cool about seeing just such deep world building in a way that also didn't overwhelm me. Sometimes with epic fantasies, I found I don't like it because it's so much like magic and world building just like stuffed at you. And this, I felt like did it in a very like gradual way. We got like little snippets where the main character will tell us like the history of something, but it felt very organic, and I just loved that about this. I think the world building was by far my favorite thing in this book, and it showed me how much I can really like world building if it's done in a specific way. It's just that a lot of epic fantasies, I think, just do it in a way that doesn't grasp my attention, where this really did. And I also think steampunk is apparently my thing, because I really enjoyed the steampunk elements of this, and I never thought I would be that kind of reader. Not because I think anything bad of it. It was just something that I thought I wouldn't enjoy, because I'm not a huge sci-fi reader either. But I've found that sci-fi I can actually enjoy as well. So, you know, we're opening up horizons. Every time I read something out of my comfort zone, I find something that I really like. And this is something that was a little outside my comfort zone, but I tried it anyway, and it proved to be something I really love. And it's definitely a favorite historical type fantasy now. So really happy I got to that one. We have 2 more until we get to my top 4. The next one I want to talk to you about is The Beautiful Ones by Silvia Moreno Garcia. This is a historical fantasy. Do we see a theme here? It's got a romance, but it's definitely messy. Like, this is the most messy romance type book I've ever read. There is so much to unpack in here. We're following our main character, and she has like an ability of telekinesis, but she doesn't really know how to use it. And she ends up meeting this guy who is like world renowned in telekinesis, and he does like shows, kind of like magician shows, but with telekinesis. She meets him and kind of falls in love with him. Well, he realizes that she is living with this woman that he used to have a relationship with and be in love with, but they separated a long time ago, and she's actually the cousin of that woman's husband. And he decides to court her so that he can kind of get to her cousin-in-law. And it gets messy, let me tell you, because there are some not good characters in here. Silvia Moreno Garcia can really make a villain, and that was one of the things that I really loved about this book, is how much this one character infuriated me. Like, so much did I dislike this character, and I thought that that was just like so cool to see in this book. And also, it really goes places. Like, it's a book, so I guess it's supposed to, but you know, I got halfway and I really thought I knew where this story was going, and then I was like, it can get messier. Like, I thought this book couldn't get messier than it was, and it did. And so I just was here for the whole ride. And in the end too, like, I still really root for this romance, even though the beginning you're like, there's no way I'm gonna root for this. Like, there's some things that this main guy is doing that like aren't okay, but in the same way, like, he redeems himself. He really does. I think it was like touted as kind of like Bridgerton, but like messy drama. And yeah. I could not put it down. I needed to know these characters, like what was going to happen to them. And our main girl, Nina, is just such a likable character. Like, throughout this whole thing, I just wanted such good things for her, and so many people were just being awful that I just like, it really made me feel for her. And I just was like, I need to know that Nina's going to be okay in the end. I can't really describe it well, but the writing in this really reflects the drama of it. It's got this beautiful, like, kind of lyrical writing that just lends itself so well to the messy drama, Victorian type vibes in here. So this is like supposed to be like 18th century Mexico, and yeah, just like the vibes of like the high society in the 18th century, the writing really reflects that, and I loved it so much. I would highly recommend, if you have maybe tried like her other stuff that's more like horror and stuff, maybe try this one, because this one's very different than her horror or her noir stuff. It's just got this like drama-filled, beautiful writing, infuriating characters, but also really lovable characters. It had everything. It had everything I wanted. So yeah, that's why it has to be on a top book of the year. Then we have another book that was very outside my comfort zone, because I don't like seafaring tales. That's The Adventures of Amina Al-Sarafi by Shannon Chakraborty. This one I picked up from Book of the Month because I had some extra credits, and I was like, everybody's been talking about this and really loving it, and I just really wanted to join the hype. But I was like, I have not traditionally loved seafaring stories. I read Tress of the Emerald Sea earlier this year, and while I enjoyed it, the thing that really held me back was like being on the boat and just not getting off of that boat for a long period of time. And I think that's what this one did really well. We're following an older character, Amina, and she is going back for one more gig and getting the band back together, because she kind of forced into it. And so you're seeing her having to go and do this epic quest that's very dangerous and high stakes. There is boat and seafaring stuff because she is a pirate, but you're also stopping off at different ports, you're meeting different people, you're going and like having side quests in places. And I think that's why I really liked it. We weren't just stuck on this boat, just doing daily life on the boat. And so for that, I found it really interesting. I liked getting like these old stories of like Jinn and stuff like that, and like old tales that it's like, are they actually real? And there's all these like magical places that people say, like, if you go to this island, you'll find this creature or whatever. And so I really liked that about it. I loved the world building. I loved Amina as a character. I loved the whole found family vibe in here is really my thing, and I think it did it so well. Like, just seeing these characters come together and is so great. And you get a lot of found family with like a younger cast of characters, but I've rarely seen it with an older cast of characters. I just like seeing them come together with this like big epic quest that they have to do, and they're all kind of like older. Like Amina's had a lot of injuries from like her young time when she was younger, and she's like kind of like having to fight people, but she's like creaking and like her knees hurt and her back hurts, and like just seeing that depicted I think was so cool to see in a fantasy book. And she was still so badass. Like, it was done in just such a way where like it just felt very real to getting older. It's not broken up into parts, but it almost feels like it has like these different parts to it where there's different parts of the quest. And I like the shenanigans, the way she has to like think herself out of scenarios, having a character who's really good at that. I think I've read a lot of books in the past that is like usually a male lead who has to be like smart and witty. I'm kind of thinking of like the Lies of Locke Lamora, where it's usually like a male character who's just like really smart and can like outsmart anyone. And I really enjoyed seeing like an older female character in here and doing that, because I've just really hardly read anything like that. And I absolutely loved it. Just amazing book, and definitely a top fantasy book, a top like epic adventure type fantasy book for me, which is not something I thought I was going to enjoy. And a seafaring one at that. I have to get to now my top 4 books of the year. And let me tell you, I don't think I can actually rank them in like 1 through 4. Like, what I'm going to tell you is just, they're all top like 1 spot for me. And they all just touched me in different ways. So let's just start with this one. So I read this, one of the first books I read this year, and I just thought it was going to be a good book for me, and I could not have been more right. So that is Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia Fairies by Heather Fawcett. We're following Emily Wilde as she's writing her Encyclopedia Fairies. She's going to this remote location in kind of like a Norway, Sweden setting, and it's also historical. And she is trying to track down like these last fairies and write about them. And while she's there, she's kind of like a curmudgeon. She has a little bit of a hard time like talking to people and connecting with people, and all she really cares about is she's just so focused on her work and her fairies that she just like neglects sometimes like people around her. And she kind of gets herself in a little bit of a pickle with the town. And then there's another character, Wendell Brambleby, who decides to come. He's kind of her academic rival, and he comes and he's like, I'm gonna join you. And she's like, why? No, I don't need you here. And he's like, yes, you do, because he is very charismatic. So he kind of gets the town to like love him and her. And it's just them and their like romantic relationship. It's a very, 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 very slow burn. It's about them and like these like fairy shenanigans they get into. And I just really loved their back and forth and the way that they just like talk to each other. The humor between them was so good. There were so many like times where I just was laughing out loud, and I really loved their dynamic from the beginning. They kind of bicker with each other and get on each other's nerves, but at the same time you can just see like how much they like each other, especially Brambleby to Emily. And there's a chapter in here where you get Wendell's perspective, and that was probably like one of my favorite parts of the book. There's also just so many times where you see Emily get into like these scenarios that are like super dangerous, and she just doesn't care because she's like, I'm gonna do anything for the research. And I really appreciated that about her. Also, the fairy elements in here are one of my favorite things to read. I've tried some other fairy type stories and they just haven't been for me, but I think it's like, I really like the kind of traditional old school kind of like scary type fairies, and there's something that's so cozy about this while dealing with like these evil kind of fairies, and I really enjoyed that about it. I think that like the lore and everything behind the fairies and getting like notes, you get like footnotes of Emily's research, and I liked that. I think I liked the academia side of things. This is more of a light academia than a dark academia in my opinion, and I really like that because I do think I like learning about topics like fairies and seeing someone who's so invested in that topic, but I don't love a dark academia. I don't like going to like all the kind of trigger warning side of things. I like something a little more cozy and wholesome. So while I don't think that this will be everyone's like cozy fantasy, to me it was like one of the perfect cozy fantasies for me. So that's why it's on this list, why it's on my top 4. It's something that I just never forget about. It's one of my favorite romances. I will definitely be continuing the series. It just made me feel so like warm and fuzzy inside, you know. I loved them together and I just wanted them together, and I could not stop reading when I picked this up. So that is why it's the top book of the year and in the top 4. I think this was a year of like getting into romance with other genres, and I didn't really think I was a romance heavy reader, but I think with other elements to it, I really like a romance in a story, and this is another example of that. So that's The Vampires of Alor by Isabel Cañas. Her other book, The Hacienda, made my top books of last year, and this was her release this year, and it did not disappoint. I think I enjoy this just as much as The Hacienda, but for like different reasons. So this one, I think for a lot of people is not going to be enough horror, but for me, it was like the perfect blend of like historical romance meets horror. So in this, we're following our main girl as her family's home is like near the border of Mexico, and we're right when the US invades Mexico, and they have Texas right now, and they're trying to like take more of northern Mexico. It's the Mexican-American War. And we're watching this girl as her family has to go, the men in the town have to go fight this war, and she devises a plan to go with them because she doesn't want to stay home and just get married. She wants to help and be a part of this. We're following her estranged best friend slash love of her life who comes back from being away after this big event, and he has to go fight, and it's like them rekindling their romance and having to confront a lot of things. There is a bit of a miscommunication and stuff in here, but like I think it was done really well. And the thing I loved about it was the atmosphere. So much of this is just feeling like a dark, brooding story. There's vampires in here, so they're also getting like these creatures, vampires that are trying to like hunt them while they're out in the middle of nowhere. But it's definitely a war story as well. Like it's very focused on like the horrificness of war and invasion and what that does to a society, and like having to come together to fight for their homes. And so I thought that was a very prevalent theme in here and something I really enjoyed about it, on top of the romance. Like the romance itself, I just really rooted for these two characters, and you're getting both perspectives, which is something I really liked. I liked having dual perspectives of them and how like they are miscommunicating, but like you see the reasons for it, and that's something that I really appreciated. I got to see why they are the way that they are. The way this sucked me in right from the beginning, and I felt like I was there. Like I was on this ranch with these people and feel like part of the story right away. And like all these characters just felt real to me, and I loved seeing the growth that Nina goes through specifically. But I loved that like storyline of just her trying to figure out like how she can still be herself and be who she wants to be without marrying, because her match will be like made for her. And also Nestor, who is the main love interest, he is below her in station, so like she was never going to be able to marry him, and so like conflicting emotions on that. I really liked seeing how that plays out, and it's just a book that I really think about these two characters all the time, and I really loved the slow burn, the Gothic atmosphere, this like sense of impending doom because they are being invaded, and knowing that their home could be taken. That like feeling I think is depicted so well through the writing and through the events of the story. So it's just one of my favorite books of the year. Okay, then we have Mexican Gothic by Sylvia Marina Garcia. Are you surprised, if you've been watching my channel, to see this on here? I think not, because I have not stopped talking about this book since I read it in July. This is a Gothic horror set in 1950s Mexico, following our main character as she has to go check on her cousin who has been married to this man in a remote kind of like house in the middle of nowhere, and she goes to check on her because she gets like weird letters, and she has to like figure out what's going on with this house and this family. And the way that this just felt so dark and eerie and creepy, and you're in this house that just like from the beginning feels real and feels alive and feels just so utterly creepy. I love that. I loved the way she wrote. It's like how in The Beautiful Ones, the way that she writes just really makes the setting come to life, and that was the same in here. There's just a writing style that she uses that really like amplifies the eeriness of this, and the Gothic storytelling method is something that I didn't realize I could love so much until I read this. I knew I liked it in the Hacienda, but this really solidified that Gothic is one of my favorite horror genres to read because I was so sucked in, and I like that it's so slow. It does ramp up at the end, but I like that you have to build up to this creepiness, and there's just a sense of foreboding through the whole thing that I think I like more than when you just right off the bat get something creepy and scary happening. It's more about what you don't see, and let me tell you, it goes there. In terms of creep factor and like the themes we're talking about, it does not hold back, and it disturbed me. There were literal scenes where I was like gagging because it was disgusting. And it freaked me out, and the house itself like truly felt like a very creepy character, and I could not put it down. And it's still something that I think about as one of my favorite books of all time, one of my favorite horror books of all time, and just like one of the creepiest, weirdest like kind of books I've read. And so with that, it has to be in one of the top slots of the year because I cannot stop thinking about this book, and I probably will never stop talking about this book. So that is Mexican Gothic. And then the final book is very vastly different than Mexican Gothic, and that is Half a Soul by Olivia Atwater. I picked this up mainly because there was so much hype around it and I didn't know what I was going to think about it, but after reading Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia Fairies, I decided to give this one a try, and this has to be my favorite romance ever. It's just so wholesome. It's like my perfect cozy fantasy and cozy romance. This is following our main character, Theodora, and she has an incident when she's younger where she runs into a fairy and he takes half her soul. And so because of that, she is very much like unable to display emotions in the way that a lot of people deem acceptable. And she's very neurodivergent coded. Olivia Atwater is neurodivergent herself and says that Theodora is neurodivergent. And so it's very much like coded that that's how she reacts to situations because she doesn't have half her soul. It's about her going with her cousin to like be debuted in society, and she's really going so her cousin can find a love interest, and she ends up falling in love with this very curmudgeonly Lord Sorcerer who is basically in charge of like all the magic in the town. And I loved their relationship so much. He very much challenges like the norms of society. He is having to be a part of the top upper class, but he's because of his position as Lord Sorcerer, but he very much criticizes a lot of the things they do. He talks a lot about like privilege and money and how there's so many people going without and how the upper class just kind of sits there and has their fancy dinners and does all these things when they could be using their time to like help people. So I thought that was a really interesting conversation in here, and something I really enjoyed about all her books is they have kind of some underlying theme, and class and privilege was definitely one of those in this. And we're following Theodora as she is just like learning about this society and like how she can help more, but also trying to like figure out herself. And there's like this idea of should she get half her soul back, and like a lot of the theme of this is like trying to find her other half and connect herself with her other half. I really liked the way this ended and how that all wraps up. It made me cry, it made me feel so many things, and I think it was just a beautiful message about being yourself, and I love that about it. And I loved that we got to see a main love interest who just 100% supports her. There are so many times in here she doesn't know how she's feeling, and he will ask her questions to try to help her figure out how she is actually feeling. And I loved that inclusion because it just really was so genuine and kind, and like from a place of just really acceptance of her and just trying to help her feel accepted within herself. And I thought that was very beautiful. So it's a book that really is like so near and dear to my heart. I think this is literally one of my top favorite books of all time. It's just something that really speaks to my soul and just like really made me feel so warm and fuzzy, and just a favorite of all time. I don't know if I can convey how much I loved this book. So that is Half a Soul by Olivia Atwater, and I've been waiting since the beginning of the year to talk to you about it in my favorite books of the year, because I knew the minute I read it, it was an all-time favorite forever and ever. There you go. Oh gosh. Those are my top 12 books of the year. I've definitely been talking for a really long time, so this is going to be just interesting to edit. But I hope you had a great reading year, and can't wait to see what your favorite books of the year are. And yeah, I will see you next time.